Okay, everyone. I think we'll
Please
begin.
stop. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone who's online. We request you to kindly put your video on and mute your audio. We have with us Venerable Gyalten Lekden again today to teach us on Buddhism and how to be happy specifically. This is a course for anyone who wants to learn about how to be happy. Venerable Lekden has been a student at the Seraje Monastic University since 2012. And we are very, very happy that he's coming to our center weekly, monthly to teach us on Buddha Dharma. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. We're running a little late this morning. That's okay. We're on flexible time. We can now take this opportunity, this time, to whatever running around we've been doing this morning, whatever has been occupying our time, our minds, our attention, we can put that aside for the moment. Bring ourselves fully present to the center, to the space, whether that be here in person or online. Give us a chance to center ourselves so that we might be of an appropriate attitude when we approach the Dharma. The more we practice, obviously, our experience and understanding of Dharma should infiltrate every moment of our lives. But right now, since we're beginners, it's important when we sit down to study and practice and meditate explicitly that we create space that says, this is an opportunity for us to engage in spiritual practice so that we might build ourselves up and then bring that practice with us into our everyday lives. So let's take a moment right now to create a sacred space for ourselves. And in that space, we will set a very strong intention. I think the mic is off. We will set a strong intention that we've come together today to study the Buddha Dharma, to study our minds, not for our own benefit alone, but so that we might be of most benefit to other sentient beings. So we recognize that the way we can be of most benefit to others is by improving our own mind, improving our lives, developing the wisdom and the methods necessary in order to be of greater service to others. So that is our main objective in our practice, is to serve others. So that is our main intention today. So let's set a very strong intention. Yes, I'm working on my own mind. Yes, I have the goal of finding peace and calm in my life, allowing my life to be one that's a spiritual life. But the reason for that is not my own happiness alone, but so that I might be of service to others in every action of my body, speech, and mind. And once we have some type of motivation set firmly, we will offer a few preliminary prayers to help secure that motivation, to help open our minds to receive the Dharma, to make us appropriate vessels for the teachings. So we will turn to page 36 of the Golden Prayer Book. Excuse me, not 36, 34. We'll offer the refuge and Bodhicitta prayer 3 times in Tibetan, and then once in English. And we'll continue with the other prayers on these pages in English until the Mandala offering, which we'll also do in Tibetan. So I encourage everyone to recite these prayers aloud. It helps make them more realized in your body, but you can also recite them internally if you need to. But it's good to recite them out loud because you're engaging in action of speech as well as an action of mind, both of them simultaneously. Sangye Cheran Soki Chonam La Jancho Pardu Dagni Kyapsu Chi Dagi Jinsogi Pe Sonam Gi Drola Penche Sangye Par Shok Sangye Cheran Soki Chonam La Jancho Pardu Dagni Kyapsu Chi Dagi Jinsogi Pe Sonam Gi Drola Penche Sangye Par Shok Sangye Cheran Soki Chonam La Jancho Paru Dagni Kapsuchi Dagi Jinsogi Pe Sonam Gi Drola Pincher Sangye Dro Par Shok. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginning this time and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. Now we'll offer a mandala. Traditionally, in the beginning of the teaching, traditionally we would offer two mandalas. First to be a mandala to request the blessings of all the Buddhas, and then the students would offer a mandala to request a teaching. We'll combine them both here. So we visualize the whole world system as our offering to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions the 3 times. And we request their blessings, their inspiration. Sangye Indo U Mikte Uai Yokunanda Shima Shibarsho. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the 4 continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niyatayami. And then, I know we're running late today, but it's so good to offer praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, so we'll offer that as well, which is on page 73. Praise, it highlights the importance of Shakyamuni Buddha as the one who realized the nature of reality and then taught it to all of us so that we might have the opportunity to study it. But within this praise, we also recognize all three jewels and offer them prostrations and praise. And then we recognize that the essential teaching of the Buddha is to tame our mind. And so we generate not only a sense of devotion to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and a sense of reliance upon them, but also a recognition that all of the teachings of the Buddha condense into the single point of taming our mind, and we request the inspiration and blessings that we might be able to do that. So that's part of the reason for offering a praise like this in the beginning of a teaching or a practice session. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, teacher of God, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed, transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When a supreme amongst humans, you were born in this earth, you paced out 7 strides and then said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise then, I prostrate. With pure bodies, formed supremely pure, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, flame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not, incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior having great compassion, the Founder having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you, the one gone to thusness, I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path, the sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and who also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms, atoms, and all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions. Perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see, condition things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. Great. Thank you for that. So in our Sunday morning teachings or classes together, we're trying to get to the basics of how Buddhism and our practice of Buddhist philosophy and meditation can improve our everyday lives. So we're trying to strip it down. And what I wanted to start with today is reminding us of the importance of setting a strong motivation, whatever we do. Sometimes in the beginning of a class, or even never mind class, if you have a daily practice, reciting that verse of bodhicitta and refuge at the beginning and setting motivation just becomes like second, you just do it automatically, right? You don't think about it. And the danger of doing it automatically is you don't think about it, right? So we should be very aware of it because it's powerful, right? It's powerful because we say that all of our actions are either actions of body, speech, or mind, right? Those are the 3 types of actions we can do. And all of our actions of body and all of our actions of speech are predicated by an action of mind, every single one. And so as long as we can align our mind to a virtuous opportunity, right, then that makes our actions of body and speech more powerful and more virtuous. And so by really taking the moment to recognize that my mind is a powerful thing, my mind is what gives me the capacity to become a Buddha, right? My mind is incredibly powerful. My actions of mind are the most powerful. And so therefore, I'm going to make sure that all of my actions have a sufficiently powerful mental action preceding them. That I really am trying to engage in whatever this practice may be, not just for myself alone, but for all sentient beings. And what we do when we're able to generate that mind is we're transforming our everyday actions into sacred actions. So it's how we take the profane and we make it sacred in them. And so this doesn't apply just to our meditation practice or our study like this. This is something we should do all the time, right? When you're going to work, when you're disciplining your children, when you are cleaning their dishes, you set the motivation that whatever I'm doing, I'm not doing it for whatever worldly benefit. I'm not doing it for myself. I'm doing it as a means to tame my mind, to overcome my ego, to defeat my self-cherishing, to develop compassion and bodhicitta for all sentient beings. And therefore, by doing that, you transform all of your actions into something more meaningful. So what you're doing is you're rearranging how you understand your experience in the world just by setting motivation, right? And by rearranging your understanding of the world, you are then fundamentally changing how you approach engaging in activities, right? If I look at every activity as an opportunity, every single activity an opportunity to develop my mind, then that opportunity is something I don't want to waste, right? And so a big part of that is setting a motivation and trying to do it honestly and genuinely and not just let it be mere lip service, right? Long-term practitioners, it's just a lot. One of the things we're warned against quite often is lip service because it's so easy, especially if you have many prayers that you do every day, a daily practice, that you just go through them very quickly. You know, like I know it'll take me 90 minutes to do all my daily prayers. So you just run through them and you don't think about them anymore, right? You have to combine the actions of speech with actions of mind. So that is one of the big dangers. Or especially those of us who have any sort of more advanced practice, that you forget the importance of the beginner's practices, beginner, quote unquote. And beginner is the wrong term. Those are foundational practices, right? Not beginner practices, foundational, insofar as you build everything else on top of them. So if you don't have a strong sense of motivation, then it doesn't matter how many tantric visualizations you do. You're building sandcastles right before high tide comes in, you know? Or you're building the second and third floor of your house without having a foundation. So you need to have these foundational practices. And that starts with having a strong intention with all of our actions. So our actions aren't accidental. And then on top of that, having a strong sense of refuge, having a strong confidence in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Recognizing that if we want to be free from suffering, it is the teachings of the Buddha that will offer us that actual freedom. And it is the Buddha that diagnosed what is causing our suffering. And the Sangha show us how to apply those teachings in meaningful ways. So this has to be a foundation because we want our practice, we often talk about our practice in this big long-term thing, right? I'm practicing to become Buddha. I'm practicing so I'll have positive rebirth so I can continue moving towards Buddhahood. But our practice should be both short-term and long-term. Both are important. So I should develop practices that help me right now, tame my mind right now, wherever I'm at, but then also be laying seeds for the future as well. And that's what the Dharma is offering us. And so trying to find ways in your day, take an opportunity to remember, to reset your motivation, to rely upon the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and refresh your experience of the three jewels, your understanding of them throughout your day is a very powerful experience, right? We've talked a lot about how to, in the middle of a day, in the middle of your workday, your whatever it is you're doing, how to remind yourself, take a moment to remind yourself of your spiritual practice and reorient yourself, right? Whether it be taking a minute of mindfulness in the middle of the day, something like this. And adding into that, checking in with your motivation. Do you still have a bodhicitta motivation, one that relies on the three jewels and uses that as your guiding light, or have other motivations, taken over as you fall into your daily habits? I think so. If we're relying on the Buddha Dharma Sangha, and we want to rely on the foundational teachings, then I think what is useful is to think about, especially in this idea that we're searching for happiness, to think about the first sermon the Buddha taught, which was on the Four Noble Truths. And we think about what it means that the first thing the Buddha taught was the truth of suffering. And then the truth that there is freedom from suffering and a path to be free, right? But the first thing he taught was the truth of suffering and then its causes. I look at my experiences of distress and suffering in the world, right? Whatever they may be, even though they seem like more egregious now than ever. And when I think of that, I have to take a step back and say, am I really suffering? Even if all of my worst case scenarios about the current political landscape are true and accurate and they play out as bad as possible. What is that? What kind of suffering does that mean to me? And is that real suffering? Because I'm still a human being. I still have control over my mind. I still have the ability to engage in spiritual practice, which is incredibly rare, right? So no matter how many egregious enemies, quote unquote enemies I have from the outside that are making difficult circumstances, right? I still have the power of my mind. So I still have the opportunity to engage in meaningful practice. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about suffering in that way, because it's easy to be overwhelmed. Last week, we talked a lot about understanding happiness and contentment as being free from anxiety, right? Being free from stress. But I want us to understand what we mean when we talk about suffering, to realize how pervasive it is. And therefore, we can develop the techniques to constantly search for freedom from it. But we have to understand it first. Because I think part of our problem is we are constantly surprised at our suffering. Whenever bad things happen to us or difficult circumstances arise, they constantly take us by surprise, especially if we think that we are practicing well, which is ironic, because the more we practice, the more ready we should be to experience difficulty in our path. Not our spiritual path only, but I mean our spiritual and our worldly lives. The more we practice, the more prepared we should be. Yet our sufferings take us by surprise. And that adds an extra layer of suffering, right? Because we're not prepared for it. Now, I will say before we go into it, there's a thin line to walk between being pessimistic and being realistic, right? To say, oh, only bad things are going to happen. This is samsara. Suffering is everything's suffering. So therefore, I'm never going to have a good attitude. That you're falling into pessimism, right? That's not helpful. But being realistic and saying, I recognize that this is samsara. Things don't go to plan. That's the nature of samsara. So of course, difficulties are going to come, right? Recognizing that in a realistic way, but not letting it fall into pessimism, right? Or being skeptical, but not cynical, right? Not letting your ego kind of be inflated by this. That's a hard thing to do. I was talking to a friend recently, and they were still upset by negative comments they read on a YouTube video, and they're just they were upset by people leaving these negative comments for no reason. And I was just like, well, I don't get upset by them anymore because I don't expect people through the anonymity of the internet to not behave like jerks, because that's what a wide audience and anonymity does is it makes people behave in ways that are inappropriate quite often. And she's like, oh, but I guess I still have trusted people. And I was like, oh, I have trust in people. But then I realized that the way I'd expressed my position to her, it sounds like I just don't trust anyone, which is a very cynical viewpoint, right? So it's very easy to fall into that. And it's not helpful, really. And it's very easy to be pessimistic. That's not helpful. But the language of it is very similar to what we are trying to do. So we have to be careful. We have to try to be realist and maintain some level of conscious optimism, but recognize that this is samsara. People are suffering and they're trying not to suffer, but they don't know how to go about doing it. So they lash out and hurt people instead because they believe that's going to bring them happiness. That is what happens in samsara. And if we can be realistic about that, then we can develop a positive attitude to try to help them, as opposed to a pessimistic attitude that is focused on our own ego. So that's just something to bring up, that line is a thin one to skate on, especially for us who, or for someone like me who is, so confused all the time. That's a thin line. So we have to be careful. But it's important to be realistic, because if we're not, then we're constantly surprised by suffering, right? When bad things happen, we say, wait, how could this bad thing be happening to me? And that just makes it worse. One of the things that we can always do is say, is this the worst possible suffering that I could be experiencing right now? And I don't like comparing suffering. Like, I don't think it's useful, right? I don't think like suffering Olympics are a good thing, or like oppression Olympics are useful. But even in the teachings, they always say that no matter what experience you're suffering, it's worth looking at both other humans and then other animals or different realms of beings and realize that your suffering is never the worst possible suffering, right? So there is a danger in comparing suffering to try to be like, oh no, I'm suffering more than you. There's a danger. It's often called in activist circles, it's called the oppression Olympics. So like people that have more things stacked against them, So there's a danger in following that, but it's useful. It's very useful. One of the examples of the Buddha is the Buddha was giving a teaching, and in the middle of this teaching, this mother came up who had lost her child. And he was like in great distress, and she wanted the Buddha to relieve her pain and suffering. And he said, go around your village, and from every family that doesn't know loss, collect a mustard seed and bring them to me. And And so when she came back and she realized that there was no one in her village or in her town that didn't experience similar loss, right? So we're not alone in our suffering. And that is something that's useful to remember. So it is useful to remember that things could be worse for us, right? Both there are human circumstances that could make our situations much worse. No matter how difficult they are, they could be much worse. And we could be a non-human being that has it much worse, whether an animal or a hungry ghost or a hell being. All of them have it much worse than us. That's not to downplay our suffering. That's not to say our suffering doesn't matter, or that our experience of suffering doesn't matter. It definitely matters. But it's not to let us wallow in it and say this is the worst possible thing that could happen, right? So it's trying to approach whatever we're experiencing in our lives, which is very legitimate suffering, but then be honest about it and to try to say, okay, this could be worse. So what am I doing to ameliorate the situation? Which is to say, how am I approaching with my mind? Because we can't always fix the external circumstances. All we can fix quite often is how we navigate them, right? Sometimes we can fix the external circumstances, which we should do when we can. But most important is we realign how we experience them, because that is what we have control over. We can't move beyond suffering if we don't understand it. So we have to look into our experience of suffering and say, where does this come from? Because if we want to move beyond suffering, we have to understand it, which is why it's important to understand the very first noble truth the Buddha taught. And the Buddha taught it first because we don't realize how much we are suffering. We don't really understand the nature of samsara because we have such delusions that grasp onto things as being permanent that we look at the quote unquote marvels of samsara, or the perfections of samsara, and think they're genuine happiness. And so we don't see the nature of reality in the way it truly is. That's why he taught suffering first. And so it's important, So we often talk about the three types of suffering, and it's critical to remember them. The suffering of suffering, the coarsest level of suffering, that includes all physical illness and pain and even some mental and emotional distress. That's a level of suffering that all sentient beings can recognize, even aliens, even animals. Same thing. I'm sure they do as well. All sentient beings don't want this level of suffering, all right? That level. That is the coarsest level of suffering, the suffering of pain, the suffering of suffering, it's called. Dugnel di dugnel. The next level is the suffering of change. And that is the one I think that we struggle with the most. It's not the most subtle, but I think it is the one that is most difficult for us to wrap our minds around. The suffering of change is the recognition that all of the things we accept as worldly happiness is really just a transition from one type of suffering to another, right? Because we're in samsara. And so the suffering of change is recognizing that what we consider worldly happiness is itself a type of suffering, which is a hard thing to wrap our heads around and not feel like it's cynical. But the truth is, that isn't saying we don't enjoy things when we find happiness and joy in this life, but we recognize it for what it is, which is worldly happiness, not permanent, not long-lasting, temporary, fleeting, okay? Not based in the true nature of reality, but based in favorable circumstances that, due to our past karma, happen to ripen at this time, right? And I think the examples that we always get in our teachings are very useful ways to understand this, in that, you know, if I'm experiencing the suffering of heat and I go into a cold shower, I feel relief, I feel joy, I feel pleasurable sensations, but that's really transferring the suffering of heat to the suffering of cold. And if I stay in that cold shower, I'm going to be miserable after a while, right? But in that moment of change, it feels like happiness, right? Or if I'm hungry and I have a really delicious piece of cake in front of me and I eat it, then I feel this cake is bringing me happiness. But it's just me shifting from being hungry to being satiated. If I keep eating that cake, I won't keep being happy. There's a limit, right? And so if we're able to remember that, it's not taking away our joy. What it's doing is putting our experiences of happiness in context. It's letting us experience that happiness in a more honest way. Because if I know that, you know, going into this cool shower is a temporary relief from my suffering of heat, then I can appreciate it for what it is. I don't expect it to bring me permanent happiness. I don't expect it to bring me, you know, these levels of elated bliss. But I can say, this is what this is giving me. I can appreciate it for what it is, which is a type of change in my external conditions. And then when I no longer have it in my life, I let it go, right? So it allows you to not grab onto worldly happiness in any way to believe it to be true happiness. And by not grabbing on, when you don't have those things, since you aren't grasping onto them, you're naturally more content. It allows contentment to come more easily because you're not grasping onto things. So this is the one I know I struggle with the most. And in my experience is most people struggle with it the most. Because the third one, the suffering of all compounded phenomena, is very subtle, right? And that suffering is described different ways. But the way I like to, for my level of understanding, the easiest way to understand it is, as long as we exist in such a body that has the potential to suffer, that is itself a type of suffering. The way we exist will never be free from suffering as long as we exist as made up of these compounded aggregates, right? The 5 aggregates that make up our body, 1 form aggregate and then 4 mental aggregates, right? As long as that is what composes how we exist in the world, that's the basis upon which that we impute this identity or a self, we have the potential to suffer. And that potential to suffer is itself a type of suffering. That's important to understand, because until we become free of that, and we can have perfectly pure bodies made of mind, which happens when we realize the nature of reality and develop deep insight, we'll still have that subtle suffering. So that's important to understand. But in my everyday life, it doesn't come up that often. You know what I mean? So on an intellectual level, that's important. For me, the second one, the suffering of change, is more important to try to work with in my everyday practice. You might be different, but that's my experience for me. So when I think of the suffering of change, which is largely due to how I experience samsara, it's also useful to think of the 6 general types of suffering that exist in samsara for all samsaric beings. So the 6 general types of suffering in samsara, and really, I think the first 2 are most important. I think they encompass the rest. But the first one is that everything in samsara is uncertain.
Sorry?
Uncertain. Everything in samsara is uncertain. There's no guarantee for anything in samsara, right? We expect that if we do all the right things, then we'll get the right rewards. There's no guarantee for any of that in samsara. Now, there is a guarantee that if we engage in virtue, we're creating virtuous karma, and that will ripen with positive results. But there's no guarantee you're going to see those results immediately, you know? That's the difficulty sometimes when you're trying to study karma, is we want karma to happen, to ripen immediately. You said, I've worked so hard in this life to be a good person. How come I don't get everything I want? Unfortunately, that's not how karma works. Karma often, sometimes it does. You know, we plant seeds in this life that have results in this life, both in a worldly sense, right? In the worldly sense that we engage in actions like studying the Dharma, and we can see an improvement in our mental states by studying, right? That is a type of action that we take in this life, and it bears fruit in this life. And on a karmic level, that also can happen. But until we have the insight of Buddhas to recognize this specific thing happening in your life is the result of this specific karmic cause, we just have to trust, due to relying on the teachings, that karma often plays out over lifetimes. And we experience negative things in this life due to actions we've created in the past, in this life, and more importantly, in past lives, right? Which is why we don't judge ourselves for saying, well, I'm experiencing suffering now. That means I created bad karma. That means I'm a bad person. No, it means we're a suffering sentient being, right? And now we have the opportunity to overcome that karma in this life. So samsara is uncertain. There's no guarantees. There's no promises. The story they always give comes from the Sutra on Karma, though all of the teachers tell it a little bit different. They don't tell it the way it's told in that sutra, but it's a story in the sutra of Madhgalyayana visiting a householder's, visiting a town, and seeing one householder who he's kicked out of their house, or he's not allowed in. And he sees someone sitting on the side of the road, and he's laughing as he sees this house. And they ask why, he tells the story, right? Now, often, I think in Pabong Rinpoche's Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, and maybe even in some Kappa's texts, it's often Shariputra that tells this story. In the Sutra of Karma, it's actually Madhgalyayana. Doesn't matter, same story. The story is that he sees a householder, and there's a particular householder who has a lake in his backyard, right? A pond. And he's very fond of catching the fish from that pond and eating those fish. I'm sure you all know the story, but we'll share it anyway, for posterity's sake, to remind us. So he's very fond of eating these fish. And then he dies, and he's reborn as a fish in that lake, or in that pond. And now his wife is very fiercely protective of her house, right? She's always guarding the house, checking to make sure that the servants aren't stealing anything, very, very cautious around the house. And she dies, and she's reborn as a dog, who is the dog that protects the grounds of that house. And so his son inherits the house. And at one point, his son catches his wife sleeping with another man. So he kills that man, right? But that man had such strong attachment to his wife that he's reborn as this person's son. And so then the scene that Madhgalyayana sees is he sees this householder now sitting with his wife, holding his son, eating fish that he's taken from the lake, as the dog begs for the fish bones, and he beats it and kicks it away. And he says, he sits there eating upon his father's flesh while he beats his mother. He holds his enemy in his lap, and a wife gnaws at her husband's bones. Samsara is such a farce, right? Nothing is certain. Another way we can even try to get a taste of this is, so we say that, who we understand to be our enemy now may be our lover in the future, right? Or our best friend in a future life. And definitely was our best friend in a past life. And we can understand that just in our worldly life. Like we can look at people in our lives in this life who maybe we were close to at one point, and now we've grown away from. Whether or not we've become antagonistic or not, our relationship to people has changed in this very life. So if we've experienced that in our one life, then of course we can say that the people that I'm close to now, in the past, they were my greatest enemies. And the people that I have such antagonism towards in this life now, in the past, were my kind mother, or my lover, my partner, right? My child. There's nothing certain in samsara. There's no guarantees. So that's the first of the qualities in samsara, of the natures of suffering, samsara. The second is that samsara itself is the very nature of dissatisfaction, right? Which is why when we talk about worldly happiness, that is samsaric happiness. As long as you are attached to the happiness in samsara, what you're attached to is suffering. As long as you grasp onto any happiness in samsara as if it will bring you real happiness, what you're doing is grabbing onto suffering and saying, I expect this to bring me happiness. And how foolish is that, right? And it's easy to sit here and say that's foolish, but I do it all the time in my life. So what's important is recognizing how foolish it is, and then when I'm experiencing it, say, what am I doing? Why am I grabbing onto this suffering? As if it were going to help me, right? So that's what we have to combine our practice and our contemplation, and then trying to bring it into our lives. Because it's very easy to understand these things when you're sitting in a cushion, like meditating about it. But like, when it's a really hot day and someone offers you an ice cream cone and you say, oh, this is happiness, then it's hard to be like, well, it's very, like, the marvels of samsara are considered the marvels of samsara for a reason. The perfections of samsara for a reason, because they're very enticing to us, right? We've created habits since beginning this time that makes us drawn to those things. So it's not a judgment, right? There's no judgment against us, but it's just recognition. That's what it means to live in samsara. Samsara is uncertain, and it has the very nature of dissatisfaction. We'll never find true satisfaction in samsara. Or if we're looking towards samsaric things as if they were going to bring us happiness, we'll never be satisfied. At least not permanently. We might have very temporary satisfaction. Then the next two, one is that we repeatedly leave this body again and again, and then we're repeatedly conceived again and again. So the difficulties and the strife of constantly dying and constantly being reborn is something we experience in samsara. Those are part of the nature of samsara. And since we don't have memory of it, then it's easy for us not to think that this is that important to think of, right? But if we look at the difficulties people go through in the dying process and difficulties of the birthing process, both for the child and the parents, we can extrapolate what that kind of suffering is like, right? And yet we have to do that again and again and again in samsara, over and over again. We look at people going through the dying process and see how awful it is, not just for them, but for their family as well. We say, I do that over and over again. That is the nature of samsara, is that over and over again, I have to leave this body. This weekend, Friday, actually, last Friday, was the 1-year anniversary of my mother's passing. And so the few weeks that led to her passing, I guess really the year that led to her passing after her diagnosis, was like, and even before that, to be honest, it was really difficult, right? It was difficult for the three of myself and my sister and my brother who were caring for her, but also for her. You could see, especially at the end, how difficult, like she had breast cancer, but it ended up spreading to the rest of her body and it spread to her mind as well, right, to her brain. And so she was in a sense of non-reality all the time and couldn't understand why she was experiencing the pain she was suffering and why she felt like things were happening to her because her body wasn't letting her, right? And you see that, and there's so much suffering in that, right? Yet we do that over and over and over again. I've been through that experience countless times, as have every one of you. They say that if you could, the amount of bones of all of your past lives, if they're piled together, would be taller than Mount Meru, right? Because we've been cycling in samsara over and over again, experiencing this great suffering of death and then rebirth over and over again. It's hard for us to remember that because that's not our experience, but it's important to reflect on. As part of the reason, remembering impermanence and death is one of the first meditations that we include in our practice, right? Because it really secures in our mind that I am going to die. And therefore, every moment that I have both physical and mental capacity to practice in any meaningful way is a gift that I can't waste. I have to use it, right? And then the fifth general suffering of samsara is that we're constantly shifting from high status to low, both from one rebirth to another and also in any given life, right? And this ties into nothing being certain. Yeah,
Shifting
from high to low, high status to low status. So we can see that in our very life now, when sometimes we're the top of the world and everyone likes us and we have, many people working for us or have paying respect for us, and then something goes wrong and everyone turns against us, right? But also we can see from life to life that one life you might be born, a king or a queen, and the next life, born a beggar. Just due to what karma ripens, right? We're constantly going from high status to low status. And then lastly, we ultimately have no companions in samsara. Now we have Dharma friends, we have teachers that help guide us to Buddhahood, but ultimately we have to do the work on our own, right? And when we die, all we have is our Dharma practice. No matter how many people we've cared for in our lives, they can't help us at that time. So ultimately, we wander in samsara alone. We rely on teachers to guide us, and we rely on Dharma friends to help us. That's true. But in the end, samsara is a state of being alone. That is one of the general sufferings of samsara.
So when we attain enlightenment, we are not alone.
So when we attain enlightenment and we're no longer bound by samsara, it means that our minds have elevated to such a state that we experience the happiness, infinite happiness of all sentient beings at the same time.
Sorry?
We experience an infinite type of joy and happiness at all times, and a type of connection with all sentient beings and all other Buddhas at all times, right? So we no longer, we're not, when we become Buddhas, not that I have any experience in becoming Buddha, but when we become Buddhas, right, we're no longer working to free ourselves from samsara, right? So we already have done the work. So the idea of being alone is you're being alone. You have to, when we say there's no companions, it means there's no companions to do the work to free us from samsara, that we're doing all this effort on our own. But as Buddhas, we no longer have to exert that effort, right? So there's no longer a struggle for us. So the idea of being alone no longer exists because we have this complete interdependence with all phenomena at the same time. The loneliness we experience is because we don't have a true understanding of the nature of reality, right? But as Buddhas, we don't have that obscuration. So we have the experience of other Buddhas and of sentient beings in a way that's more realistic and honest. So we don't have that loneliness anymore. Even if we're physically alone, like having no companions doesn't mean we're not surrounded by other sentient beings. It means that emotionally, we're doing the work on our own, right? So it's an inner type of loneliness, not an external loneliness. And so as Buddhas, we don't have that because we're not suffering in any way. We won't be. Does that help a little bit?
So as Buddhas, when we see suffering, don't feel anything. And if we see happiness, also we don't feel anything.
No. So when we are Buddha,
Not our suffering, but the
No,
suffering
I understand.
around.
Buddhas have developed great concern and sadness at seeing others suffer, at seeing sentient beings. That's why they work constantly to free sentient beings from suffering. And you can even see His Holiness and other great teachers, when they talk about generating compassion, it often brings tears to their eyes, because just thinking of compassion causes them to think of the suffering of sentient beings, and it brings tears to their eyes. So there is a level of sadness there, but that sadness doesn't interrupt their happiness or their joy or their bliss. What it does is it compels them to continue working to serve others. So it's not the kind of sadness that we experience as human beings that's mixed with our own ignorance, that's mixed with our own self-cherishing mind, right? So that's the difference. It's not like once you become a Buddha, you just float above everything and ignore everyone. Because there's still the compulsion to serve other sentient beings. And that compulsion strengthens by seeing those who are suffering. Right? The Dalai Lama is a great example of this. He's often talked about after leaving Tibet, he thinks of the situation of the Tibetans that are still living in Tibet under occupation. And it makes him incredibly sad, right? But that sadness doesn't stop him from trying to help them and trying to help the Tibetans who are in exile as well, right? So that a Buddha's experience of sadness isn't the same as ours because it's not something that overwhelms them. It's just them recognizing other suffering. And it doesn't interfere with their actual state of bliss, which is to say that they have a mind of contentment that can never be disturbed, right? Because they have perfect equanimity. That's the important thing too. A Buddha's happiness isn't dependent on external causes, which is what we're trying to do as well. So they say that a Buddha could have, one person on one side massaging the finest oils into his skin, and on the other side, someone stabbing him with a knife, and he would consider them equally. His love for them would be equal, his compassion for them would be equal. It has nothing to do with the external circumstances, the way that they relate to other beings. And so we need to develop equanimity in that same way, that we can relate to all other sentient beings, as well as to all phenomena or all circumstances with the same type of mind. So those 6 general sufferings of samsara, they're important to remember because when we feel overwhelmed and we start asking, why are these bad things happening to me? Why am I made to suffer this way? Remember, I'm not made to suffer this way. This is the nature of samsara. I'm born in samsara due to negative karma I created. And the very nature of samsara is suffering. And so what this should be doing, our experience of suffering, should be helping us develop a mind of renunciation, right? A mind that wants to be free from suffering. And so part of that is going to be recognizing what's causing our suffering, but also what's causing not just our long-term suffering, but also our immediate suffering. So part of developing a mind of renunciation is being able to recognize the self-cherishing mind, being able to recognize the 3 poisons of attachment, anger, and ignorance, and how they cause the self-cherishing mind and how that exacerbates our experience of suffering. Because when we can recognize that, we can do something about it in the immediate moment, right? Just knowing that we exist in samsara, that knowledge, that intellectual knowledge doesn't help us. We have to allow that knowledge to change our outlook or our experience. And that comes through, the 3 practices of study, contemplation, and meditation. So again, though, when we try to recognize the nature of samsara, we see it as suffering. When we look at all of our difficulties that we experience, we try to develop contentment that accepts that suffering as the nature of samsara, but that it's not a defeatism. We're not saying, okay, this is the way it is, it'll never get better. So fine, right? We're not falling into pessimism, but what we're doing is saying, this is the nature of samsara, therefore, I'm going to do my best to be free from samsara. And if that means I can do things in my life to improve the physical or material circumstances, I'll do those things. But more importantly is, I will also do the things that help my mind stay strong and level and content, regardless of the external circumstances. So it's not a type of defeatism, right? It's not just saying, oh, well, this is samsara, nothing's good. Like that doesn't get us anywhere. So we have to understand the nature of suffering so we can learn how to be free from it. And then we try to enact that. And so we practice study, contemplation, and meditation. We take time in our spiritual practice to really recognize our experience of suffering and where it came from. So we can do a meditation where we go through in the evening, try to go through our experiences of the day. And if we had any overwhelming experiences of suffering or experiences of worldly joy, we look at them and say, where did they come from? were they purely from external actions or internal actions? And then how did I act when I experienced those? So if someone insulted me, and for me that created this like real emotional roadblock that messed up the rest of my day, then I say, well, where was the suffering? Was it in the words that they spoke to me? Or was it in my opinion of myself as not being worthy receptacle of those words? And therefore my self-cherishing mind is what really caused me to suffer. Those words were just the external factor that caused my self-cherishing mind to start making a fuss. And then even at that, I could have let it go and not been bothered the rest of the day. But instead, I created more problems for myself, right? So when we can look through our day and just notice what are the things that happened and how did I relate to them? Or when did, I went out to lunch with my coworkers and had a delicious meal, then that made the rest of my day happy. What does that mean about my relation to that suffering of change? Was it a healthy one where I appreciated the meal, but then I missed it when I didn't have it? Or was it one where I said, this is a temporary happiness, I'll exploit it while I can get it, and then allow myself to then not grasp onto it as the only way to be happy? So at the end of our day, we look through those periods of explicit suffering and also worldly joy and say, where did they come from? And how did I relate to them? And if we can identify where they came from, then we see, did I relate to them in a healthy way, in an appropriate way, or an inappropriate way? So this is a place to look at those things we could do better, but also celebrate the things we do well, right? It's not just about self-chastisement. It's about to say, this thing happened at work and it caused me to be really frustrated, but then I was able to look and realize what was going on and let it go and not be affected the rest of the day. And so then we rejoice in our own successes, right? Because that's the way to encourage more success, is by rejoicing in our success. So it's not just about self-chastisement. You say, I need to do better, I need to do better. That's part of it, but that has to be paired with celebrating when we do things well. And this allows us to combine our study and our practice with our everyday life. And what we'll find, I think, when we do a practice like this, is we see that most of our experiences of suffering, sometimes we aren't even aware of them when they're happening, right? Because we're so overwhelmed by them that it's not until afterwards that we can say, oh, this is what was going on and was affecting me. But when we can recognize them, we see that it's because we are grabbing onto samsara and expecting it to bring us happiness, right? That's what we'll find, I think, almost all the time. And so that is what encourages us to practice the mind of renunciation. So we know the three principal aspects of the path, right? We condense a lot of our practices into three: renunciation, bodhicitta, and wisdom. And that if we can practice these three, that brings us to Buddhahood, right? Like that is the essence of our practice. The three principal aspects of the path to Buddhahood: renunciation, which is to say, giving up on samsara; bodhicitta, which is orienting yourself to work for the benefit of others; and then wisdom, which is recognizing the nature of reality and applying that to all of your practices. Now, we need to do all of those, or work on all of those things all the time, right? We study the path sequentially, but really we need to practice the whole path all the time. But renunciation is a really important place for us to start. And so by renunciation, we need to know what is it we are trying to give up, which is why we're talking so much about suffering. It's why the Buddha taught suffering first, literally, because we need to know what it is we are giving up. And I think it isn't inappropriate to want to not suffer in this life, right? Like that is not an inappropriate wish. Now, it's unrealistic to think that I can live in such a way that I'll never experience suffering, because we live in samsara. We have compounded bodies. We're going to experience old age, sickness, and death, definitely, right? We're going to experience physical suffering no matter what in this body, in this life. So the wish that I never experience suffering is not realistic, but it's not bad to not want to suffer. What's bad is to say that if I'm suffering, then I'm not going to be happy, right? if we can experience illness and old age and other physical sickness and other difficulties and not let them affect our happiness, that's what we're trying to do. Because as long as we're samsaric beings, we're going to be experiencing obstacles, both physical obstacles and emotional obstacles. If we're allowing our happiness, our peace of mind, to be dependent on external circumstances, then we'll always be unhappy. Right? So renunciation isn't saying I'm giving up on life. It's I'm giving up on the suffering of this life. And I'm giving up on the belief that I would never have to experience suffering. Because I have to, as long as I'm a samsaric being. I have to at least experience the physical suffering, right, of getting older, right? That's just going to happen. Of sickness. We all experience sickness. What's important is that I don't look upon that as being the indicator of my mental well-being, my emotional well-being. When the teacher at the center in Boston had liver cancer, he lived for a little over a year after his diagnosis. He continued teaching the whole time, and he was taking Tibetan medicine, but he wasn't doing any Western medicine. He was in a lot of pain, you could tell, physical pain. His body wasted away until he was like a skeleton. Geshe was his name, Geshe. And he was in his 70s, I believe. And he would still come in and do 3 prostrations before he started teaching. And it took him a lot of energy to do those prostrations, but he was going to because he was teaching teachings of the Buddha. He wasn't going to not prostrate. And you could see he was in physical pain. Yet he was never unhappy as a result of it. You know, his mind, he had been practicing for so long. This was a Buddhist, so one of the original Sergei monks who left India following His Holiness Dalai Lama in 1959 and fled through the Himalayan mountain range and then lived in West Bengal in Buxa before coming to Sera. He was one of the ones that helped build Sera in the early 70s down in Balakuba before moving to America. He didn't allow his physical state to dictate his emotional state, even as his physical state got worse and worse and worse, right? So it was a really wonderful example for all of his students to see this is what it means to experience the suffering of illness and the suffering of old age. Even this really highly realized being, whether or not you saw him as your guru, it was clear that he was incredibly skilled and scholarly and a great practitioner, right? This incredibly practiced being is clearly experiencing all these sufferings, yet he isn't upset by them. So it was very inspirational to see. So it's something we can aspire to, recognizing that in samsara, we will experience the uncertainty of samsara, the dissatisfaction of samsara, and the suffering of birth, old age, sickness, and death, right? Of not meeting what we want and of meeting what we don't want. Those are general types of suffering that we experience. Yeah.
But wouldn't it have been realistic of him, since he was in so much pain, to not do those prostrations? I mean, he would have spared himself some pain, which is not a bad thing, is it? I mean,
For him, taking appropriate physical actions to ameliorate physical pain is not a bad thing, correct? For him, his dedication to the Dharma was such that if he had the physical capacity to do prostrations, he was going to. And then by the end of his life, he wasn't able to, so he did mental prostrations. But as long as he could do them, even if they were difficult, he chose to. Because that was his dedication to it. He's like, I'm going to sit on a throne to teach the Dharma, and I have the physical capacity to prostrate to that throne first and to the Buddhas who shared this Dharma, then I will, even if that's difficult. So for him, that was a priority. And the physical pain didn't bother him. Because at that point, he experienced physical pain, but it didn't upset his mind. Because he practiced for so long that even though he was experiencing physical pain, it didn't upset his mind at all, which was the important part. For us, that's not realistic, right? Like physical pain definitely upsets my mind, right? And so he didn't go out of his way to seek out physical pain, but his commitment to the Dharma said that, and his level of practice said that that physical pain didn't bother him, you know? So in his case, it was, like I said, an inspirational, but it's the same with all of the Buddhists. If they're very inspirational, doesn't mean we can do the exact same things in our life right now, because we're not Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. We're working towards it. So we let that inspiration, especially if you look at a lot of the stories, you know, the most famous one is in one of his previous lives, when Shakyamuni Buddha was a bodhisattva and he gave up his life to feed a hungry tiger, right? Before she could eat her cubs. That's the type of bodhicitta we're supposed to develop, right? We can't do that in our lives. That'd be impossible to do that and still have a mind of no anger or frustration or any negative minds, right? But that is what we should aspire to. So we hold that up as the inspiration and recognize that due to our circumstances, we're not there yet, right? But we want to be there. So we use our experience and our awareness of suffering and samsara to develop a mind of renunciation. Mind of renunciation, in Tibetan, it's Nejung Sampa, a mind of definite emergence that we translate often or interpret as meaning renunciation. But the actual word, the compound word in Tibetan means a mind or a thought of definite emergence. And so what it is a mind that emerges from samsara, right? That's where the etymology comes from. And that's what it means to renounce samsara, is to move beyond it, right? And so we have to know what suffering is, and we also have to know what Dharma practice is, and not get the two confused. The example they always gave when we talk about renunciation is with Drum Tompa, right? Drum Tompa visiting a monastery, one of the monasteries he founded. So Drum Tompa was one of the 3 heart disciples of Atisha in Tibet in the 11th century. He was a lay person, he had a family, but he also founded a monastery and achieved Buddhahood, right, as a lay person. And there's a story of him visiting this monastery and seeing an elderly monk who is reciting the sutras. And he said, "Oh, that's so wonderful that you're reciting the sutras. Wouldn't it be better if you practice Dharma?" The monk is very confused, right? Because he thinks, I thought I was practicing Dharma. And so then he says, "Oh, he must mean that I should meditate." So he starts meditating more. And then Trungpa Tompa comes back and sees him and he says, "Oh, that's so wonderful that you're meditating. Wouldn't it be better if you practice Dharma?" So now the monk's very confused, right? So he goes, "I must need to circumambulate holy objects." So then he starts circumambulating. And Trungpa Tompa sees him again. He says, "Oh, it's so wonderful that you're circumambulating holy objects. Wouldn't it be better if you practice Dharma?" So finally the monk is like, "Well, I don't get it. I thought I was practicing Dharma. What am I doing wrong?" And Trungpa Tompa says, "You need to renounce this life, right? As long as you're engaging in these Dharma practices for the purposes of this life's happiness, then you're not renouncing samsara, because you are looking at samsaric happiness and you are attached to it, thinking it is real happiness." So he was saying to that monk that he wasn't actually practicing Dharma fully. He was going through the actions of practicing Dharma, but he was still attached to the happiness of this life.
But why did he think that? What gave him the idea that maybe the monk was actually...
Well, Dhamtompa, in this story, we have recognized that Dhamtompa was already a realized being, so he could see that this monk's actions were focused in a small way. But true, for me, I don't know your mind. So you could be doing whatever action. I have no understanding of your intentionality, right, or your mind. I can only observe the outer action. So for us, we shouldn't go looking at others and telling them how to be. But when you have a master in front of you who is one of your teachers, then they can understand your mind and your motivation sometimes better than you can, right? So in that circumstance, it's not our place to be telling others what to do, but we use that as an example to look at our own minds and say, even when I'm practicing Dharma, am I practicing Dharma because I want to find happiness in this life? Or is it because I want to be free from samsara? And it's okay to realize that the better conditions I have in this life, the better I can practice, and the more I can help others in this life, and the more I can work for the future. But that's okay. It's okay to want things in this life. But we need to recognize that wanting them for the sake of wanting them isn't good enough reason. I don't want to raise because I want more money in this life. I want to raise because I recognize that having a better fiscal situation will give me more opportunities to be helpful to others in this life and to commit myself to practice more because I won't be constantly worried about money, for instance, right? So it's okay to want nice things in this life, but we can't be attached to them. We can't let our happiness, our internal happiness, depend upon samsaric happiness. So it's not like we need to all, move to a monastery in the middle of a refugee camp. It's only for some of us. right? We don't all have to give up everything, right? Renunciation doesn't mean selling your home and becoming like a wandering homeless person. That's not what renunciation means. You can have nice things and you can want nice things in your life. Like we don't want physical discomfort, right? That's okay. But we just have to recognize that not wanting physical discomfort isn't because that physical discomfort is suffering. I don't want physical discomfort because I want the opportunity to be of more service to others, practice Dharma, to study. And that physical discomfort is an obstacle. But that isn't acceptable. We have to have the mindset that my suffering isn't because of the physical discomfort. My suffering is because of the way I relate to it, whatever it may be, right? And important in that is, even if we don't want to have external difficulties, we're going to still have them. So then how do we relate to them when they come? That's the important thing. How can we transform our experience of suffering into opportunities of practice? And there's a couple ways to do this. One is when we experience suffering, we recognize it as the ripening of negative karma we've already created. And if we're able to do that and actually recognize it, not just say those words, but recognize this is the experience of a negative karma I created. That's actually, this is going to sound counterintuitive, an opportunity for joy or celebration. Because any negative karma that ripens in this life, as I'm a human being, it could ripen much worse. It could be a karma that causes me to be reborn in a lower realm. But instead, it's ripening on me right now, even if it's ripening as cancer, as sickness, as something really, really hard. It could ripen in a more difficult situation when I had less opportunity to navigate it with whatever mental or emotional capacity I have right now. So you should be joyful that those negative karmas are ripening now when you have some sort of means to navigate them, as opposed to how they could ripen in the future. Because every negative karma that ripens now is one less if you've gotten rid of it, right? You've exhausted it. If you experience it without creating more negative karma in the process. That's the important thing. So that's one way to understand suffering and to incorporate it into your practice, is that every experience of suffering we have is a result of negative karma we created that is now ripening. And because it's ripening, that means it won't ripen again in the future. Because it's ripening now when I'm a human being, I have access to the Dharma, I'm still of relatively sound mind, I have some sort of means or capacity to engage with it, then I'll do that. Like that's an opportunity for me that I wouldn't have otherwise, or I may not have in the future. The other way is to look at suffering and recognize that our experience of suffering is because we expect something else to happen. Our experience of suffering, the real difficulty of it is because we have this expectation that we shouldn't suffer. So we forget that we are in samsara all the time. That's not to say we deserve. I don't like the idea of like, I deserve suffering. No, I don't mean that. But if we're in samsara, we're going to suffer, and we just forget that. And so then when we experience really gross levels of suffering, we're taken aback by it. So if we're able to remember it, we're not surprised by it, then that's part of our practice. That says this is the natural state of samsara, is one of dissatisfaction. And because of that, I'm not going to let that upset my level of contentment. I'm just going to use it as a way to continue practicing Dharma. So the important thing is, if we want to be free from suffering, we have to understand suffering. If we want to be free from suffering, we also have to understand the causes of suffering. Right? That's why those are the very first two of the Four Noble Truths that we're taught. First suffering, and then the causes of suffering. The cause of suffering, most importantly, being, for our experience, our self-cherishing mind, and that self-cherishing mind itself coming from our ignorance, our fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of reality, right? So when we understand that, when we understand the causes of suffering, we can start doing the necessary work to undermine those causes so we don't create more opportunities for suffering in the future. And when we do experience suffering, we realize it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from our own actions in the past and from our actions in the present, our self-cherishing mind. And because of that, we can relate to that suffering in a healthier way to allow it to be an opportunity to practice Dharma, to practice meaningful growth, and not be overwhelmed by it, not allow ourselves to compound our suffering or whatever it may be, by adding on to it with mental distress that's unnecessary. So it's 11:30 now. What I thought I'd do is I thought you could do a meditation on equanimity. I think it's useful. That equanimity, recognizing that trying to create no distinction between our experiences. Well, there's different ways to think of equanimity. The most common practice, and I think what we'll do for our meditation, is recognizing that there's no distinction between friend, enemy, and stranger. So that's equanimity that's relating to other sentient beings, right? But we can also develop equanimity to our circumstances, right? That if I am sitting in, the lap of luxury, or if I am in like a hotel room that is nothing but like a concrete floor, I can still have a peace of mind, right? So we can develop equanimity, not just in relation to other sentient beings, but also in relation to our circumstances. And it's important for both. But for this meditation, we'll focus on equanimity relating to other sentient beings. And then in our practice, we can develop that same level of equanimity towards our environment as well. So let's start with that. We'll do that for a while. Then we'll take a break, stretch our feet, and then we will have an opportunity for some more questions at the end. Okay. So let's get ourselves comfortable in whatever way we need to for our meditation. So if we're sitting, make sure we have a nice stable seat, one that is going to let us feel connected and not discomfort. If we're in a chair, then we want to have our feet flat on the ground. In either case, regardless of if we're on a cushion or in a chair, we want our spines to be nice and straight, our chest to be up and open. We can let our hands rest naturally on our thighs or our knees, depending on where they fall of their own accord. If you'd like, you can also put them in the meditation mudra. Your right hand on top of left, your thumb is just barely touching at the level of your navel, your elbows out. And that's also a common place, but you can also let them just rest where they lie naturally. Let your head rest gently on the top of your spine, following its natural curve. You're not tucking yourself down deep into your chest, and you're not lifting your head up high, but letting it follow the natural curve of your spine. You want to be relaxed in all of your muscles, and everything about your countenance should be relaxed. That includes a nice relaxed jaw. So you're not clenching your teeth. Your jaw might hang open a little bit, and that's okay. You can allow your tongue to rest on your hard palate, behind your upper teeth. And now, if possible, allow your eyes to stay at least half open, gazing down the edge of the tip of your nose to a space about 1 meter in front of you. They're not focused. You're not picking out individual objects in front of you, but you're allowing your eyes to stay open. You're not cutting off the world. Part of our practice is trying to tame our mind in the midst of samsara. So we want to be able to wake up, which is to say we don't cut everything out by closing our eyes, if possible. So once you've adopted this posture, let your breath fall into its own natural rhythm. You don't have to force it. Now allow your awareness at first just to ride on your breath. So as you breathe in, you can say to yourself, breathing in. And as you breathe out, you can say, breathing out. Allow the natural rhythm of your breath to be the focus of your meditation. Notice that you're distracted, whether it be from an external distraction or an internal distraction. Your mind wanders. Just recognize that. You can label it distraction. Then allow your awareness to return to your breathing. Breathing in, breathing out. And now I want you to visualize in the space in front of you, someone in your life you would label as a friend. This could be a relative. This could be someone that you care about. Someone whose relationship with you is pervaded by the experience of attachment. This is a friend. Visualize this person in the space in front. Visualize an actual person in your life. And as you visualize them, I want you to bring to mind the fact that they are a suffering sentient being in samsara. So recognizing that, develop strong compassion, a wish for them to be free from suffering. You can experience that compassion as a ball of white light growing brighter at your heart. And as you wish for them to be free from suffering, visualize that compassionate white light being emitted from your heart, bathing their body in the space in front, and being absorbed into their body, totally eradicating their suffering. Now let the person in front dissolve, and in their place visualize someone you might have the label of enemy. Someone whose relationship with you is marked by hatred or anger or frustration or harm. As you visualize this person in front of you, recognize they are a suffering sentient being. They too are suffering, and they too want to be free from suffering. And recognizing this, again, develop strong compassion toward them. Wish for this enemy to be free from all suffering. Visualizing it the same as before. the brilliant white light of compassion sent out of your heart, never diminishing. Our capacity for compassion is infinite, so it never diminishes. It's absorbed by the person who visualized in front, eliminating their suffering. And now let that visualization dissolve. And in the space in front, visualize a person who you would consider a stranger. So someone whose relationship to you is marked by ignorance. Someone you may have seen at the store, at the street, maybe a coworker who you don't really know very well. You have neither enmity towards nor friendship towards. Visualize them in front. And once you have them strongly visualized, recognize that they too are a suffering sentient being who doesn't want to suffer, only wants to experience happiness. And again, let your brilliant heart of compassion grow and swell until it emits from your heart center brilliant white rays of light that bathe the person in front, is absorbed into their every pore, and eradicates their suffering. Genuine wish for them to be free from all suffering and the causes of suffering. The mind of compassion is infinite. You never run out, no matter how much you emit this brilliant white light. And now visualize all three of these people at the same time in the space in front. The person who has the label of friend, the one who has the label of enemy, and the one who has the label of stranger. As you can see all three of them in the space in front of you, recognize it is only due to the uncertain nature of samsara that one of them is marked by attachment, one of them is defined by anger, and one is defined by ignorance. The three poisons that keep us suffering in samsara. That is the only distinction, this mere situation. And in fact, all three sentient beings are the exact same in that they wish to be free from suffering, They wish for happiness, and yet they don't know how to achieve that happiness. They generate this incredibly strong mind, wishing them to be free from all suffering and all of the causes of suffering. Let that mind fill your whole body with brilliant white light. And then as it shines out of your body, it's absorbed into all three of them equally, because there's no distinction. The distinction is temporary and circumstantial, but it has no truth to it. So all three of them are equally bathed by your brilliant compassion. Generate strong conviction in this. My enemy, stranger, and friend are the same in wanting to be free from suffering. The only distinction is the circumstantial differences of this life due to the whims of samsara. Contemplate this as you visualize the brilliant light of compassion washing over them. Recognize that no one of them is more deserving than the other of your compassion. No more deserving to be free from suffering. They are equal. Their differences are all temporary, circumstantial, due to the uncertainty of samsara. Allow yourself to really focus on this with confidence. The distinctions between these three are due to my own samsaric mind, afflicted by attachment, ignorance, and anger. It has nothing to do with their true way of existing in the world. They all are deserving of my love and compassion equally, regardless of circumstances. Admit that I will treat them with equal love and compassion. And as all of our relationships with other samsaric beings fall into one of these categories, let these three become representatives of all sentient beings. Recognize that all sentient beings are equally deserving of happiness. They all deserve to be free from suffering. And they all are deserving of my love and compassion, so I will strive to treat all sentient beings equally to see there's no distinction between any sentient being other than the mere circumstances of samsara. And you can let the visualization in front fade, but allow the visualization of that great compassion at your heart center to remain, that brilliant white light that isn't affected by the three poisons of attachment, ignorance, or hatred, but instead is indiscriminately sent to all sentient beings. Let that brilliant white light remain and just focus on that for a moment. Firm in your belief that you will work towards the freedom of suffering for all sentient beings. That your capacity for compassion is infinite. And now, if you're comfortable, try to maintain that recognition of the brilliant white ball of compassion at your heart as you return your awareness to the room, into the space, and others. Thank you. So with that practice, if we can, we try to keep that visualization throughout the day. And that taps into some of the way when we practice Tantra, we're supposed to keep our tantric visualizations throughout all of our daily life, right? We're not supposed to only visualize those things when we're meditating. So it's similar with meditations on compassion. If we can try to keep that visualization going throughout the day, then that helps us in our everyday life to be more compassionate. And especially the power of equanimity. It can totally restructure how we engage with other people. When we have conflict from people who are, being mean to us or acting in an inappropriate way, when we can recognize them as being suffering sentient beings deserving of our compassion in the same way that our loved ones deserve our compassion and in the same way that strangers do, then it allows us to not be as pierced by whatever harm they're doing, right? Because we recognize that harm is due to them being a samsaric being who is wanting to be free from suffering and doesn't know how to do it. So I encourage you to try to maintain that visualization or some level of it as much as you can. Because, as I said, throughout the day, that lets you tap in more quickly. The stronger you can keep that going. But for now, let's take a brief break. So it is 11:58. Let's take a 10-minute break, stretch our feet, get some refreshments. Then we'll come back and have a little bit of closing time and Q&A, okay? Okay, everyone, let's return to our seats. Now that we have been fed and watered. So what I really wanted to get at today was I want to help us develop a healthier relationship to our experiences of suffering. because we can't avoid them in this life. But if we can develop a healthier relationship with them, so we're not overwhelmed by them, then we can have a healthy attitude and reaction to them. So we develop a mind that recognizes suffering is inevitable, since we are samsaric beings. We don't seek it out. It'll find us on its own, but it's inevitable. So when it comes, we accept it as part of what it means to live in samsara. We use it as an opportunity to investigate what actions of our mind are expecting it not to be there, and an opportunity to rejoice that we are purifying negative karma that we created in the past. So these are all things we can do at the same time, right? We experience an obstacle. We recognize this is the result of our negative karma. We have joy that that negative karma is ripening in such a way that we have the wherewithal, the emotional and mental capacity to navigate it in a healthy way. And then we recognize what about these external circumstances are causing our emotional distress. What expectation do we have that's causing this? You know? And it could be something, so for instance, it could be mixed. And what I mean by that is, let's say I am taking the bus here to come teach, and the bus breaks down on the highway, which has not happened to me more than a few times. But it has happened, right? So your bus breaks down on the highway, and I realize I'm not going to be able to get here in time. So I'm very upset. You can be very upset by this, right? This is a normal type of suffering we experience. No physical suffering, but all of a sudden I'm facing adverse circumstances, right? So then I'm upset by this. Then I have to say, well, why am I upset by this? In my heart, I'd like to say I'm upset because I'm depriving the center of an opportunity for me to share the Dharma. But is that the real reason? Or is that just part of it? Is the real reason that I think people will think poorly of me? Or my opportunity for people to respect me is going to go down? How much of my self-cherishing mind is being mixed in with that, right?
Or it could be some amount of attachment to comfort where you expect things to go a certain way. I expect to be in Bangalore at this time.
Exactly.
And now I'm not.
That's another good part, especially coming from it's one of the big obstacles you have as someone who lives in the West who comes to India, is that things just don't go the way you expect them to quite often. And if you're not prepared for that, you're right, even if I don't have anywhere to go, but things aren't going the way I planned, and now I have to wait for a new bus or whatever, it can be very disturbing to the mind, right? Because as you say, I'm expecting comfort and I'm expecting things to follow plan and they're not. So that's an opportunity to look at all those things and say, why am I allowing my mind to be so distressed? Because that isn't helping the situation, right? And now part of that may be true that, let's say that I am going to have to miss a teaching. I can regret that, but I can make sure that I'm separating that from my own ego and from my own comfort, right? So make sure I'm not using that as an excuse, right? But then I can have genuine regret. We have to miss a teaching, for instance, but that isn't the only reason I'm suffering. And I look at the other reasons and I realize they're coming from my self-cherishing mind in some way or another. That happens all the time, right? So that's what I want us to practice doing. And for better or worse, we're going to have opportunities to practice that all the time, right? Because we're going to have incidents of suffering, both big and small, all the time in our life. And so every one is an opportunity to look at your mind. The example they often give is it's like being shot with an arrow. So there's a person, the story or analogy is like a person who is in the forest and he's shot with an arrow. He can't avoid being shot with that arrow. He's already experiencing the pain of being shot with the arrow. It's happened already. So his option is to remove the arrow and dress the wound and then continue on, or to say, where did this arrow come from? Who shot this arrow? What's it made of? And instead of actually addressing the situation, compounding his own suffering, right? So we can't avoid being shot by the arrows of samsara as long as we're samsara beings. What that means, physical pain or suffering or circumstances that are beyond our control. We can't 100% avoid those. We can do work to try to not put ourselves in difficult situations, but in the end, we can't avoid them. What we can avoid is creating more stories about that suffering and then exacerbating it so it becomes out of control. Because that mental suffering is always going to be worse than the physical suffering. It may not seem that way at the time, but that mental suffering is what lasts. That mental suffering is what is grasping onto samsara and saying, this is happiness. How come it's not making me happy? Right? So that's what we can do. And that's what I encourage us to do in our everyday life. To use our experience of samsara as an opportunity to develop the mind that wishes to be free from samsara. To use the experience of samsara to analyze our self-cherishing mind. Realize how all the self-cherishing mind does is harm us. Create more suffering. This wish that everything will be perfect for me all the time, that I will have every comfort, I will have profit and gain, that people will like me, that people will compliment me and respect me. All those minds, those intentions, they don't. The computer doesn't have any electricity, just so you know. Those minds, those intentions, they don't bring me to happiness. They only remind me that samsara is never going to be actual happiness. Right? If I am constantly seeking out my own comfort and I am incredibly distressed when I don't have that comfort, samsara isn't comfortable. So I'm always going to be distressed. If I can develop a mind that is realistic and says, of course there's suffering, both on a personal level, on a societal level, on a political level, why would I expect not to experience suffering? I'm a samsaric being. That's not pessimism. It's not giving into it, but it's saying, I'm not going to let suffering surprise me. What I'm going to do is be realistic about it, let it motivate me to want to be free from suffering for myself and other sentient beings. Instead of letting my mind exacerbate the suffering, make it stronger, I will experience it, do my best to ameliorate it for myself and others, and then create the genuine wish to actually be free from suffering, which means eliminating my self-cherishing mind, eliminating my hatred, my anger, and my ignorance. A lot of that starts with being able to develop a mind of mindfulness, a mind that recognizes when we're telling those stories about the arrow, right? When we're able to realize, wait, I'm adding to my own suffering. But that's important. When you have those moments where you realize, wait a second, this is way more difficult than it needs to be. And all this is coming from me. You know, when we have being able to have those moments come from looking at our mind. Right? So we need to do these practices so we can see our mind more clearly. And to bring it back to the very beginning of our discussion today, a lot of that comes from setting a motivation repeatedly throughout the day, empowering your actions of mind. Say that in everything I do, I'm going to dedicate my mind and my actions to be of benefit to others. I'm going to dedicate my actions to not be clinging to samsaric happiness as if it were real happiness. You don't have to set that dedication just when we wake up in the morning or just when we do a meditation session. Throughout the day, whenever we begin any new activity, we look, why am I doing this activity? And how can I take this worldly activity, whether it be at my job, at my home, with my family, how can I look at this worldly activity as an opportunity to move away from samsara, even if it's a worldly activity? How can I wash these dishes with a mind that says, I am training myself to be content with whatever circumstances I have to navigate, even if they're boring or they are physically uncomfortable, right? So you set that intention to strengthen your mind so it becomes second nature. So that no matter your circumstances, your mental activity is always virtuous. Your mental activity isn't one that clings to samsaric happiness. So with that, maybe we will have some questions. Yeah.
So I read this book, the Matthew Rickards autobiography, and there he has an incident where he has tapeworm, and he wasn't having the medicine to get rid of the tapeworm in order not to the young man, not to kill it. And then his teacher, Dilgo Kensei Rinpoche, tells him, makes him drink it and says, your life is much more valuable than the life of a tapeworm, and which I see, but aren't we supposed to be thinking that all life is same, is
Mm,
equal?
Good question. It's very difficult. Things like tapeworm and other similar situations. So we say that all sentient beings have the same capacity to become Buddhas, right? There's this idea of Tathagata Garba, Deshishibe Nyingpo, right? All sentient beings are equal, 100% equal in their capacity to become Buddhas. So some call that Buddha nature. Yet, due to our circumstances, some lives have more opportunities than others. So it is true that animals, actually, according to the teachings, beings born in the animal realm can actually generate a mind of bodhicitta, possibly. There are like examples of nagas developing bodhicitta, and nagas are considered part of the animal realm. So it is possible. Yet, the opportunities, the animal realm in general is pervaded by ignorance, right? And animals aren't able to study or practice Dharma in a meaningful way, by and large. Whereas if you're born with a perfect human rebirth, your capacity to practice is much, much greater than that of an animal. So in that circumstance, we say not that your life is more important than the life of a tapeworm, but the opportunities available to you are so important that to give them up for the life of a tapeworm would be a misunderstanding. But that is a hard decision to make. And we sometimes have to make it because we are suffering sentient beings. And so having his teacher give him that advice allowed him to go through with that action with a clean heart, yet he still engaged in the act of killing. So he still accumulated karma of killing that tapeworm. But he did it, it was a mixed karma, and I'm sure he did many purification practices to try to overcome it. So it's not like just because we say that, then we don't have karma, right? We still have negative karma of killing. So you have to try to balance it out. It's hard. Our example that we get is from Gyalten Tokme, right? The Tibetan meditator who composed the 37 practices of Bodhisattva. And the story from his life is that he saw a beggar who there was a beggar near his monastery who he always gave his meal to. And one day the beggar wasn't in his normal place. So he went searching for him and found him. And he was like hiding in an alcove. And he said he'd been kicked out of the main square where he used to sit because he was dirty and his robes or his cloak was filled with like lice and ticks and other, and he was kicked out. So Tokme Zampo took off his brand new robe that had been offered to him by his students, and he said, "Here, I'll trade you." So he took the beggar's robe that was covered in lice and ticks and other vermin, and he started wearing it. And then he started getting very sick because all of these insects were biting him, eating him, taking his life force away. And his students said, "You can't keep wearing this robe. What are you doing? You're just making yourself sick." And he said, "No, I have to have compassion for these fleas and for these ticks and for these lice as well. And if I stop wearing this robe, they'll all die." And his compassion was so great that he couldn't take off this robe. And yet, due to his great compassion, he allowed them to feast on his blood and his flesh, but they stopped laying eggs. So when that series of lice and ticks died, no more were born. And then he regained his health, right? But he was also a realized being who had actual great compassion, where we're just doing our best. And, we don't have that yet. So we have to deal with reality. We have to deal with samsara. And sometimes we have to make difficult decisions. And then when we have to make difficult decisions that cause harm, then we do our best to purify those negative actions. And it's a hard decision, but that's part of being in samsara, especially if you have children and family. You often have to make decisions that are difficult, right? We had one case in Boston where one of our members started raising chickens, and they weren't in Boston, they were outside of Boston. And their chickens got like some sort of chicken lice or something, some sort of parasite that lives on chickens. And their option were to let these parasites eat their chickens to death, basically, or they had to use some sort of medicine that would kill all these parasites. And they didn't know what to do. And they said, well, you put yourself in this situation where like your actions are directly going to cause the death of one of these two because you have chosen to raise chickens, right? So like our teacher was very much against raising animals because he says you're creating a prison for them. So he's like, this is a good reason. Look at, you have adopted, you put yourself in a situation where you have no good option. And so you have to choose the least awful of the two options and then do your best to purify it. But you're in samsara, so you're often faced with situations like that, So don't invite them by putting yourself in situations like that. If you can avoid it, but you're still going to get them. Like, I'm sure Matthew Ricard didn't invite himself to get a tapeworm, but you travel around India in the 70s, the likelihood of that happening was, not small, and it happened. So he had to make a decision, and he was fortunate to have a teacher who was able to, when you can follow your teacher's advice, it makes it a lot easier, right? But you have to make that decision. But yes, that the short answer is that tapeworm does have a capacity to become Buddha, but due to it being born as a tapeworm in this life, its opportunities were much less than a human. And therefore, the human life is considered more precious. That's why it's a perfect human rebirth. It doesn't eliminate negative karma from killing that tapeworm, but it does create a context where you can make a decision.
So there is a sort of a pecking order.
There are different teachings that look at it differently. We say that the pecking order is your capacity to study and practice Dharma is what's most important, right? And so but that can get a little bit eugenicsy if you're not careful, right? So you have to be very careful with it. But as human beings, we can say we have a capacity that almost no other sentient being does. And therefore, it's worth preserving human life as best possible. But as the story with the Buddha, when he sacrificed his life for a tiger, he felt that the negative karma this tiger would create by eating her cubs, that's the only way to survive, was so great that he had nothing but compassion for him. And since he had already achieved these realizations of bodhicitta and an understanding of emptiness, he was able to sacrifice his life in a way without any regret or anger. But we can't do that. So the math isn't like 100% all the time. You know what I mean?
Yes, I know. But like just as a follow-up to that,
Okay.
If he had lived the Buddha without sacrificing his life for the tigers, he would have probably been able to, not that I'm just trying to understand, he would probably have been able to help so many more people through his teachings and whatever, like he had such a capacity, but he still chose one tiger of the 3 tiger cubs and the tiger over the which I'm
Because in that moment, right? So in that moment, he was a young prince, and the suffering of that tiger was so great that it was something he could do something about immediately. Whereas this potential to teach others, he couldn't see the future, right? There's no guarantee that you can help others in the future.
he could see, he was a Buddha.
No, he wasn't. He was a bodhisattva in that. Right? And we have no guarantee of our future. So he knew he was so overwhelmed by her suffering. And his actual level of bodhicitta was that this was something he could do. But it's not something most of us can do. And I agree with the argument, right? That like save one or save many, that's a balance. I think if you develop the level of compassion and bodhicitta that he had, your math gets changed a little bit. Do you know what I mean? Again, that's why that example or that story is for inspiration, that we should develop bodhicitta to the point that we wish that we could give up our life for any one sentient being, that's the goal. And when we recognize that as the goal, then that helps increase our experience of compassion in this life. So that is the goal, is that we should be willing to sacrifice all comfort and up to including our life for any one sentient being, regardless of who they are or how they're related to us or not related to us. That is what it means to have actual great compassion and bodhicitta. And we're not there yet. So we recognize that as the goal. It's a hard thing. It's, when you see that story, when that story is told, it's told in a couple of different places. But one time it's told in the Sutra of Golden Light in 21 chapters. And in that story, after he does that sacrifice, right? He's with his 2 brothers in the forest, and he tells his brothers to leave. So he's by himself when he does it. And then the whole hunting, then once he does it, the ground shakes, right? And there's this big thing. And his brothers find his body or his remains, and they're incredibly distressed. And then you see the scene in the kingdom with the queen and the king, who are incredibly distressed. The queen has this awful dream of holding 3 doves in her hands, and one of them is snatched away by a hawk, and she's bleeding from her breasts. And then the hunting party comes back and they tell her that they found their means for a son, and she rends her clothing and screams in pain, and she becomes non-conscious. She passes out of pain, her and the king both. And so for me, that's an incredible story because we see the actions of the Buddha are the actions that we should aspire to be able to do in our life. Be willing to sacrifice ourselves for any one sentient being. And yet we see the worldly response to that is overwhelming grief because it is so outside of our norm of understanding. It's impossible for our worldly minds to experience that the same way a Buddha or Bodhisattva would, because it is so discordant with our understanding of the world. So for me, I like to look at that story in its whole, and we see what the Buddha did and see how everyone around him responded, because they still had worldly expectations. And we aligned with them, right? Not with him, because we're still very worldly people. But for me, that gives me a lot to meditate on. It's not like a clear, easy story. That's like, here is A, here is B, you know? It gives you inspiration, but also it's difficult. And so it's worth contemplating because it's not clean or easy. I see there is a question online, but I can't read it, unfortunately. Oh, do you have it? Okay. The screen has like moved, so I can't read the whole screen. That's okay. I think we'd better keep to scroll up.
There's no nothing else here.
No, scroll down. You're going too fast.
Oh, okay, it's in between.
Right there, right there.
This one.
While we are aware that suffering is inevitable, at times we feel that there are too many problems and it's not fair, and why me? What can we do in the short term and the long term to overcome this? Okay. So both of these, trying to have short-term and long-term remedies. The long-term remedy is to meditate on the nature of samsara, the nature of suffering, right? And that is going to be the first step for either short-term or long-term, is to try to understand the nature of samsara and the Four Noble Truths. And now once we become convinced of this, the short-term solution is, as I was saying before, try to create the habit when you experience suffering to look at it and see, where did this come from? Is my distress merely due to circumstances, or am I adding onto it with my emotional reaction? And so the easiest way that I find to do that as a beginner is try to make time every day at the end of the day to review my actions of the day. And I can review those actions where I created more distress for myself than necessary. And when I get into the habit of doing that every day, then it starts becoming natural. When it actually happens, I see it happening. So at first, we're still trying to tame our mind. So at first, it's useful at the end of the day to do just an inventory of what happened in that day and how did I respond to it, right? And once you create that habit, then your mind gets more attuned to seeing the ways that you are exacerbating the suffering, right? So unfortunately, it's not like we can just flip a switch and right away stop doing it. So it involves, one, doing actual study, contemplation, and meditation to become familiar with the Four Noble Truths, especially the different types of suffering, how suffering exists both as physical pain, the suffering of suffering, also how all worldly happiness and samsara is itself a type of suffering, and grasping onto it as if it were real happiness just makes that suffering more egregious and more powerful. And how, as sentient beings born in samsara with these compounded bodies made of the five aggregates, our very capacity to suffer is itself a type of subtle suffering. So we have to become familiar with this. And then through that familiarity, we use that as the lens through which we can analyze our actions throughout any given day to see when suffering was unavoidable, like my car broke down or I twisted my ankle or whatever it may be. That was unavoidable. But then how did I react to that? Did I react in a healthy way or an unhealthy way? Did I make my suffering worse, or did I accept it and then try to find a healthy way forward? So once we have a firm understanding of the nature of suffering, then we use that in our meditation to analyze our actions. And as that becomes a habit, then we don't only do it at the end of the day, but we do it in real time. And when we can do it in real time, that's when it's most powerful. But it's a slow process to build that up. Anything else? I know we've gone a little late, but anything else? Any other questions?
I'm not able to forget my past sufferings.
Hmm.
That happening. Keeps coming back.
So past experience of suffering keep coming back. And does that help you? Right? So then that's the first step, right? It's recognizing that you're still holding on to this past suffering, right? And then so what you do then, one thing you can do is then engage in a meditation where you look at one of these past experiences of suffering that you're holding on to, and you try to genuinely recognize that this isn't helping me. And how am I harming myself by still holding on to this, right? And then through that, because right now it's easy to say, right? The language is, oh, I know that I'm doing the saying something intellectually and then having an experience of it are two different things, right? So you've already gone through the first step, is the intellectual recognition that this isn't helpful. So then the next step is to actually, in a meditation, take time to look at how am I allowing these past sufferings to be brought into my present and create more suffering for myself. Like be very honest in meditation with it, right? And look at your own mind and say, how am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And then what can I do to overcome it? You know, when I see myself doing that, what is an immediate remedy I can do? And it's going to depend on what those experiences are, you know, so I can't give you like a blanket remedy. But if you know that, you know, there's a certain experience that often comes to mind, you say, okay, what can I do? And when I recognize that, to step away from it. And so the first step is developing confidence in your meditation practice to do that. And then as you can get stronger doing it in that situation, then you can apply it in your real life, you know, or your everyday life, I should say. It's going to depend on the circumstances. But you've already done the first step, which is developing an intellectual understanding, right? So then we have to do, that's why we often say these three. We have a study, contemplation, and meditation. So first we learn something new, we gain an intellectual experience of something new. And then contemplation is we look at it from all sides. We try to convince ourselves in the accuracy of it, overcome any doubts. And then we actually meditate on it to develop wisdom based in that realization. So we have to go through these three steps, you know. So if I'm not giving specific examples, I have to be a little vague.
For
But
example,
okay.
what the other person was wrong,
Mhm.
and should I forgive him that time?
So what? So when someone else harms us, right, and they do something harmful, should we forgive them? And so the question is, what does we mean by forgiveness, right? When we forgive someone, is it benefiting them or benefiting us?
Us.
Right? That's the question, right? And generally we say to forgive someone isn't about them, it's about us. Because we recognize that they're acting out of their own suffering. When someone harms us, it's because they want to be happy. And they think that by harming us, they're going to find happiness, right? That's why they do it, due to their own ignorance. And we do the same thing to others without meaning to. So we realize that their act of harm was actually out of their own suffering. And so when we realize that, we say, because they're a suffering sentient being, I should have compassion for them. I shouldn't be angry at them because they're suffering. They're trying to be free from suffering and they don't understand what they're doing. So when you can have that recognition, then you can let go of your frustration or harm or anger towards them, because you realize that that anger, that resentment isn't harming them in any way. All it's doing is making you take that one moment of suffering they gave you and extend it out longer and longer and longer. So by forgiving them, it's not saying that it was appropriate for them to harm you, but it was saying that they already have done that action. I'm not going to let that harm to continue in the future by holding on to it, by creating more harm on top of it. So forgiveness isn't for the other person, it's for our own mind, right? And so the way we get to forgiveness is through compassion, recognizing that all harmful actions are due to suffering. Now, I'm not saying you should let yourself be harmed. So if you're in a situation, old people often look at, like, if you have a spouse that's abusing you, should I just let them keep abusing me? No, you should take circumstances to protect yourself when you can.
They take advantage.
So then you have to, depending on your circumstances and how they're taking advantage, it is appropriate to take necessary steps to protect yourself, right? That is appropriate, depending on the circumstances. But you have to do that with the mind that says, why am I doing that? Not because I care about my own self, but because they're continually causing themselves more suffering. Think about it. Anytime someone harms you, what they're doing is creating negative karma for themselves, right? Which is going to cause them to have negative rebirths in the future and more suffering in the future. So if I'm able to rearrange the external circumstances to prevent them from causing negative karma, that is one way to help prevent them from causing more suffering for themselves, not for me, right? So you can do them, you can engage in that rearrangement of the external circumstances, but don't do it simply because you want your own comfort. Do it because you want to help the other sentient being to not create more suffering for themselves. And that way you can create a virtuous motivation that's based in compassion, isn't based in self-cherishing, but it still is helping make the external situation better for you and for them. It is difficult to do, right? But that's part of how our mental action is so powerful that the external action may look the same, right? Sometimes the external steps may be the same, but our motivation is different. And so the way it affects our mind is different if we do it with a motivation based on helping others versus self-cherishing.
But in this, what you said, I could also do it, arrange my external circumstances to help me by taking responsibility for myself and say that instead of constantly saying that person makes me unhappy, that person insults me, I'm going to arrange my external circumstances also to help me so that I am not constantly in the company or whatever around that person. So I take out of a sense of responsibility, yes, sure, out of the compassion to help. But suppose you're not there, like your compassion is not so great. But isn't this somewhat wisdom where you say, I take responsibility for myself, and it's possible for me to arrange my circumstances in such a way that I don't need to be with that person, and I shall do it.
That's true. But we can do both, right? So for instance, when we're working on our mind to develop calm abiding, what's the first piece of advice is to abandon your homeland and go to an isolated place. Give up your homeland, all the places that give up all the relationships that you know bring about attachment and desire and anger and ignorance, right? So that's the first step. And it's exactly what you're saying, is recognizing, having the wisdom to say, I'm doing this to create the best possible circumstances for me to work on my mind, right? So that is invoking a type of wisdom, right? But at some point, if our mind is strong enough, then we shouldn't be affected by those external circumstances, right? So like developing calm abiding wisdom or single pointed concentration, once you've developed single pointed concentration, you can be in the busiest marketplace in the busiest city and be able to focus on any object without any effort, right? Because you've done the work. So first you create favorable circumstances, you do the work. Once you've developed it, then you bring it into your everyday life. But at that point, then if they're still engaging in this harmful behavior, it may not be affecting you, but it is affecting them, right? So you do both at the same time. So you can say, this person right now is causing me harm through whatever, through the way they're treating me. So because I want to be able to maintain a practice of a peaceful mind, and I recognize that this is an obstacle to doing that right now due to my level of experience and practice, I'm going to relocate myself or change my external circumstances. But I'm not doing it simply to benefit me, but also to benefit them, right? So you can do both. And you try to cultivate always a mind that cherishes others as more important than yourself as your primary motivation. But it doesn't have to cut off, like you said, it's wisdom realizing, I want to give myself the best opportunity, right? I don't want to have to run a race with one hand tied behind my back. So I will do what I can to help myself as well. But it's always with this other focused motivation, if possible. Oh, there are more messages on here. Okay. Maybe we will. Okay.
I feel being kind and helpful backfires sometimes. Endless requests from friends and family to take care of them because I've tried my best to be there. But sometimes I feel bad to say no. Do I lack wisdom to tell people when I'm unable to help? How do I be compassionate to myself?
So it's a difficult situation, right? That it's easy to be taken advantage of when you are always putting yourself out there to help others. on one hand, as we were just saying, it's important to recognize when you're doing something in such a way that it's only causing you frustration. So if you helping others physically, right, or being there for others is actually causing negative minds to arise, such as minds of frustration or feeling taken advantage of, then you have to navigate, is that a healthy attitude or a healthy behavior for you? Part of the reason those minds arise is because we have expectations that when I go out of my way to help someone, they are going to be respectful of my time and be respectful of my actions and be grateful, right? And so that what that kind of does is it makes our actions of service not completely pure, but tainted by worldly concern and focused on what we're getting in response to what we give. And this is natural, right? Because again, we're suffering sentient beings. This is a natural response. So we have to find a balance of being able to offer service, whatever that may be, in a way that doesn't expect anything in return. And if it gets to a point where we feel like we are being taken advantage of in a way that's causing distress in our lives, that is either taking up too much of our time, then we have to develop a healthy attitude to recognize these are my limits and this is what I can do and what I can't do. So then I have to say no in these circumstances, because if I say yes to all of them, I'm not in a place where I won't be resentful of that. You know, if we regret engaging in positive actions, that regret becomes non-virtuous, right? Regret is considered a changeable mental factor. If we regret doing harmful actions, that regret is virtuous. But if we regret doing virtuous actions, that regret is non-virtuous. So if we are constantly putting ourselves out there and then we regret it, then we're not really helping anyone. Our help is very temporary only. So we have to try to make sure that when we offer service, we do so without expecting anything in response. And if we feel like we're being taken advantage of, to the point where that's affecting our mind, then we have to create boundaries, healthy boundaries. And maybe we'll get to a point where we don't need those boundaries anymore, or the boundaries might shift due to our own personal practice or our own personal time, our own personal whatever it may be. But for this moment, creating healthy boundaries is totally acceptable. And so you have to find a way to create those healthy boundaries, but at the same time recognize you're doing it because you don't want to develop resentment, right? Okay, I think maybe we're gonna have to end there. We're already going about 20 minutes late. So I apologize. I'm very grateful that you spent some time with me today and let me yammer on and on. I like spending time with you, so I'm appreciative of that opportunity. Just so everyone knows, there'll be no class next week because Friday is holy, and so a lot of people are taking 3-day weekends. So we're not going to make anyone choose between a 3-day weekend and attending class on the weekend. So there'll be no class next weekend. The week after that, Venerable Gyalten will be here. And I think what we're trying to do, at least for the next 2 months, before we had arranged it, so I would come 1 week and then Venerable Gyalten would come the next week and we'd go back and forth. But what happened as a result of that is it's difficult to come in person twice a month for any one of us. Right now, I came last week and this week because we're not in classes right now, we're in between. So I can come twice in a row and it's not difficult. Once we start attending debate again, which will happen in a few weeks, it's difficult. So when we were going back and forth, we ended up doing online 2 weeks in a row because he would come in person, then I would come in person, then he would go online and I would go online, right? So we want to avoid that. So he is going to come 2 weeks in a row and do one in person, one online. And then I'll come 2 weeks in a row, one in person, one online. And that way we won't have 2 online classes back to back. So there'll be probably one in person and one online, one in person, one online, like that. That's going to be the attempt at the schedule moving forward. It may change, but we're trying to figure out a way that we can be here as much as possible because we feel that it's important to kind of be in the space as much as possible. But regardless, there'll be nothing next week, in person the week after that. The weekend after that, so the 21st and the 22nd. But so let's end with dedication prayers. So I just wanted to give you that announcement, but we'll end with dedication prayers. So we set a strong intention at the beginning of our practice today together That was virtue in the beginning. And then we studied the Dharma, we studied our minds, we explored the teachings of the Buddha, and that made our practice virtuous in the middle. And now we'll seal that practice by making it virtuous at the end, by dedicating any merit we've accumulated to the benefit of all sentient beings. Instead of keeping any of that merit for ourselves, we wish that it may ripen on others. And so turn to page 36 in the Gold Book, and we'll just do these verses quick. We'll do the first dedication prayer in English, then the second one in Tibetan, and then English, and then the long life prayer for his holiness. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Choe Khor Sum Ling Ma Ke Panam Ke Gyoshe Ke Wanyam Pa Me Pa Yang Gone Gone Pel Wa Sho. May the supreme jewel of bodhicitta that is not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Great. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for us who joined us online. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.